George Burns was America's favorite comedian for 8 decades. He amassed an enormous wealth of more than $30 million. His 2 adopted children believed they would inherit everything. However, Burns made a choice in March 1996 that was unexpected. He wrote his children entirely against his will. Each and every dollar went to a different location. All his family could do was ask questions. According to friends, Burns kept several secrets from everyone. The stunning betrayal that occurred years ago is the true reason he left his children behind. George Burns was born on January 20, 1896, in a little flat at 95 Pittsburgh Street on the Lower East Side of New York. "Hasn't your doctor told you, now, George, you got my doctor is dead?" Nathan Birnbaum was his name. Then, everything around him moved loudly and quickly. His parents, Dora and Louis, brought their old world customs into a small new world after fleeing poverty in Ruptica, Galatia. He was the 10th of their 12 children. The family crammed themselves into 3 small rooms, where people provided more warmth than blankets. Louis was a caner who made just enough money to support the family. To help the neighbors, Dora washed clothes. The majority of children on the Lower East Side shared beds and wore second-hand clothing. On several occasions, dinner consisted solely of potatoes and onions. Bread even seemed like a present. Nevertheless, George recalled the hum of life in those rooms, the Yiddish jokes, and the laughter. That sense of humor stuck with him. In 1904, everything changed. When his father unexpectedly passed away at the age of 47, he was 8. The family lacked a backup plan and savings. After 5th grade, he had to help, thus school ended for him. For 5 cents a shine, he stood on street corners shining shoes. He persisted despite the length, filth, and cold. He occasionally earned a little extra singing with the Imperial Five, a children's quartet. Their promoter stole their money one evening. George slept in alleyways because he had nowhere else to go and discovered what true hunger and terror felt like. He nevertheless carried those evenings like covert training. They gave him street smarts and toughness that he would employ throughout his life. His identity changed as he matured. His family referred to him as Natty. His shine box earned him the nickname Shoe Birnbaum from other kids. He rolled cigars. He was a newspaper salesman. He sneaked into burlesque theaters to see performers create laughs out of nothing. That was the life he desired. When he was in his early teens, he gambled recklessly and attempted to swim across the East River. He nearly drowned as the current swept him beneath. He was frightened by that moment, but it also made him feel crazy. He soon tried on various stage names. George Burns was descended from the Burns Brothers Coal Company and his brother Izzy, George Birnbaum. Once, in order to provide warmth for his family, he had taken coal from them. In order to trick booking agents and keep his job, he later even used identities like Captain Betts and Willie Delight. He felt the need to run at the age of 14, and he did. In an attempt to succeed as a vocalist, he moved away from home in 1910 and joined the Mickey Rooney Stock Company. In a theater in the Midwest, he gave his first paid performance. However, the audience jeered him till coins fell on the stage, and he froze, forgetting every word. He was immediately sacked. He always said that it was the best lesson he had ever learned, even if the humiliation was painful. He then sang on street corners, in brothels, on ferryboats, and wherever else that could give him a little cash as he traveled the Midwest. He hardly ate on some days. Even though he didn't get much sleep on some nights, he felt active and continued to move. He was still pursuing the theater at the age of 17 in 1913. Together with his sisters Beatrice and Irene, he created a singing group known as the Burning Three. They visited gritty vaudeville theaters with gritty patrons. George and Beatrice were left penniless after Irene abruptly left with a sailor. George returned to New York with empty pockets and a big ego after pleading for a rail fare to travel home. But he never considered giving up. During those years, he learned how to improvise, deal with dubious theater owners who wouldn't pay, and endure the pain of failure without losing his passion. He attempted to enlist in the Navy when World War I broke out, but they turned him down because he was too short. They preferred taller males, and he was 5 feet 7 inches. Rather than give up, he discovered another path. He sneaked into groups of entertainers on troop ships while posing as a woman named Barbara. It was dangerous. He avoided one mistake that may have led to his incarceration. He prayed that no one would find him as he sang for soldiers who were homesick. He laughed about it later, but at the moment, it was just survival. He was often saved by reinvention. When he partnered with ballerina Elsie Rain in 1916, he believed he had discovered his calling. They performed on the East Coast and developed a ballroom act. However, Elsie left him for a richer guy, leaving George stranded once more. Weary and broke, he accepted a job on the boardwalk at Coney Island as a soda jerk. He practiced jokes on clients while serving ice cream. While some chuckled, others turned to leave. He learned timing from all of them. He gained the ability to read people and make quick adjustments. Later on, he made a joke about how this job helped his career more than any producer had. He was playing solo and going by George Burns full-time by 1920. During the Prohibition era, he worked at speakeasies where raids may occur at any time. He had to hide in a coal bin one evening to escape being discovered. He was covered in black soot, embarrassed, yet oddly empowered when he climbed out. He realized after several evenings that he required a stage partner to keep him balanced. He required a companion who could keep up with his cadence. In 1923, that partner made an appearance. At a booking agency in Chicago, he met Gracie Allen. When Maggie Healy, a dancer, forgot her lines at an audition, he fired her out of annoyance. He later met Gracie, a 27-year-old Irish-American entertainer whose family business had collapsed. Although their initial encounter was straightforward, he sensed something new about her. If she wanted to try his act, he inquired. During their rehearsal, Jane was supposed to play straight and George was supposed to be the funny guy. However, everything changed when they appeared in front of a throne. People made fun of Gracie's naive perplexity. Everyone's attention was drawn to her by her voice, timing, and fast responses. George altered the act overnight after recognizing it right away. He took on the role of the patient spectator who allowed Gracie to shine, and she became the eccentric character. The magnetism was evident in their first performance together at New York's Hill Street Theater. They were adored by the audience. Waves of laughter rolled. They learned what worked and what didn't from that early routine known as 60-40. George claimed that he would never be able to match the vibe that existed between Gracie and the crowd. They created successes like their Dizzy and Lamb Chops performances after joining the Pantages circuit in 1924. They purchased their first car and made $50 a week. At last, life seemed to be opening up. By the end of 1925, George experienced an unpleasant apprehension. Gracie was being courted by another performer. He told her she had to make a decision on Christmas Eve. Get married to him or leave. Gracie agreed, even if it was audacious and disorganized. On January 7, 1926, they tied the knot in Cleveland. Despite its modest size, the ceremony had a significant impact. From that point on, their personal and professional lives became intertwined. They agreed to a 6-year contract with RKO a few weeks later, which stipulated that neither would be allowed to perform alone. It bound them together in a decades-long partnership. Although stability was guaranteed by the contract, life presented fresh challenges. During rehearsals, Gracie started passing out. It was eventually determined by doctors to have a lifelong cardiac ailment. George had never thought someone so vivacious could be so brittle. Still, she continued to perform. For years, she persevered through suffering and tiredness, winning the respect of everyone in her vicinity. She eventually had to quit in 1958 due to that ailment, which ultimately caused her death in 1964. However, she carried the show on her shoulders during their ascent with a strength that the audience was unable to witness. Something changed for George Burns and Gracie Allen when they took the stage at the Palace Theater in New York in 1927. A vaudeville act could only perform at the Palace. And when they made $1.50 a week as headliners there, it seemed like the dream they had been pursuing for years was finally attainable. The spectators adored them, particularly Gracie's odd reasoning that consistently worked despite its incoherence. The laughter from those evenings followed them everywhere, and critics likened them to the Marx Brothers. Although their ascent appeared swift from the outside, it was preceded by years of hardship, role-changing, and the realization that Gracie was the real spark that lit up the room with a series of perplexing questions. They were forced into the next phase of their ascent by the palace, which locked them in as a top act. They traveled across the seas for a 15-week BBC radio tour in 1929, 2 years later. Everything was intended to go smoothly, but British customs confiscated George's cigars as soon as they got there. He had smoked since he was 10 years old, and now he had nothing to soothe his anxiety. He therefore incorporated the annoyance into their performance by turning it into jokes about withdrawal. The audience in Britain adored it. Their habits spread throughout a continent that was unfamiliar with them but accepted them by keeping radio hours full and salaries high. They were well known throughout the world as a result of that tour, which also demonstrated how, with the correct handling, various laws, customs, and behaviors could be made humorous. They were large enough for the Ziegfeld Follies, one of America's most glitzy productions, by 1931. Eddie Kaner and others were performing on the same stage as them. However, Gracie found the journey to be draining. Train rides became into unending trips between cities since she detested flying. She twisted her ankle mid-performance at one show. Despite the excruciating discomfort, George grabbed her up and carried her onto the stage so she could continue performing without the audience noticing. They were followed by another narrative. Evidence of their close relationship and regard for the audience that occupied every seat. George was performing something that few performers dared to accomplish at the same time. He utilized their theater earnings to covertly purchase repossessed real estate during the 1929 crash, while others squandered their money on upscale hotels and clothing. While the nation was in a panic, he was purchasing properties for pennies on the dollar. These investments kept theaters solvent when the Great Depression struck and they had to close. George had foreseen the situation and ensured that the performers would not drown when the industry trembled, while many others had nothing. In 1930, they made their cinematic debut with Paramount shorts like Lamb Chops. But there was a twist to that moment as well. The projector erupted and the reel jammed during one viewing, causing George's eyebrows to burn and the room to fill with smoke. Rather than fleeing, he immediately made light of the mishap, riffing about the explosion as if it had been planned. The executives were in a state of shock. They had just seen someone instantly transform dread into fun. And more doors were opened by such rapid thinking than by any rehearsed remark. On February 15, 1932, the George Burns and Gracie Allen program began airing on NBC, marking their radio breakthrough. The 15-minute episodes revolved around Gracie's bizarre miscommunications, which inexplicably resolved every issue. Nearly 40 million people watched every week by the middle of the 1930s. At a time when most shows did barely achieve half that audience, that amount was quite unbelievable. It had a casual, largely spontaneous, and unexpected style. Real laughing, real confusion, and real sparks between them were audible to the audience. In only a single year, ratings increased by more than 60%, from 19.3 to 31.3. They had demonstrated that radio could function without strict scripts. All you needed were two individuals who understood how to complement one another, honesty, and rhythm. Then, as part of a lengthy comic routine in 1933, Gracie conducted a fictitious presidential campaign. It was dubbed the Surprise Party by her. She printed ballots and traveled to 39 states. During the actual 1940 election, several voters really scribbled her name in, confusing local officials until they realized it was all a hoax. She intended to provide cabinet jobs to pals who wore fine clothes and pledged to tax only the appropriate types of clouds. The tagline was "It's in the bag," and the mascot was a kangaroo. The campaign caused news agencies to re-evaluate how readily entertainment and politics could coexist, and it increased their radio ratings by over 40%. Despite being a jest, it served as a reflection of the nation. Their collaboration continued to surprise people even in the background. George created almost all of the scripts, although he consistently claimed that Gracie was the driving force behind them. He wanted the public to notice her talent in a time when males typically grabbed all the glory. Gracie joked that she had forgotten she was married to George in one of the 1935 episodes. Fans believed it to be genuine. George was accused of mistreating her in thousands of letters. To dispel the misunderstanding and declare that their marriage was solid, he had to appear on live radio. Rather than harming them, the incident increased their ratings by 20%. People cherished the sense of realism in their fiction. When they transferred to CBS in 1934 for $10,000 per week, that was the next significant development. That payment was unbelievable at a time when the majority of Americans earned less than $2,000 annually. They began incorporating actual occurrences into their play, particularly after Gracie's 1937 emergency appendectomy. In addition to including actual doctors on the show, they made her surgery a plot point. Everyone was captivated by the blend of comedy and truth, which altered the way radio writers told stories. It gave the audience a sense of intimacy, as though they were family. They were so successful by 1938 that they purchased a Beverly Hills house. It ought to have been a tranquil prize. George, however, left a smoking cigar on a table one evening. The cigar rolled, ignited a fire that spread more quickly than anyone had anticipated, and burnt through fabric. The house was just barely saved. The tale was widely reported by newspapers. Rather than concealing the scare, they turned it into an episode titled "The House That Burns Built." In the writing, Gracie placed the blame on herself and turned the catastrophe into humor that further enchanted the audience. They gained charm by being able to laugh at their own errors. For them, Hollywood was also a significant phase. Their huge broadcast in 1932, where their duet, Love and Bloom, made them national celebrities, marked the beginning of their foray into the film industry. However, censorship issues continued to plague them. Gracie's dizzy jokes were deemed too provocative by studio management, who felt that they needed to be rewritten. During filming, George would smuggle the original lines back as ad-libs. Although it was a light-hearted uprising, it influenced how comics eventually defied rigid studio regulations. When the flimsy wire used for Gracie's chandelier stunt broke in 1933, she was plummeted approximately 10 feet and almost harmed an international house. George was directly beneath her when he caught her, breaking 2 ribs. As though the tumble were a natural part of the performance, they continued to laugh. Unsure whether to continue rolling or seek for assistance, the cameraman stood motionless. That scene was used in the movie, transforming a near-tragic event into a timeless comedic classic. They collaborated on Stare on a Damsel in Distress with Fred in 1937. Gracie blurted out that she was lost in London during a crucial scene when she became frightened and forgot her dance moves. There was no pause and a look. The entire set laughed as he danced around her bewilderment and transformed it into an impromptu act. Later on, he referred to it as pure magic. It demonstrated how rapid thinking may transform mishaps into memorable events. They performed for soldiers in 1941 during WWAN, boosting morale throughout the camps. However, Gracie became embroiled in an odd scandal. She sneaked a few pairs of silk stockings to give as gifts because they were hard to come by during the war. It was considered contraband by the authorities. Before George used all of his resources, she was on the verge of being confronted by a court-martial. After that, the troops adored her even more. It turned into one of those untold tales that showed off her courage. They were at the top by 1945. Two Girls and a Sailor, their movie, made almost $4 million. But Gracie's condition started to deteriorate. She had to take a 6-month hiatus due to severe migraines. George discreetly started drafting his book during her leave. He wished to keep their story intact, particularly the little details that only they were aware of. Later, that draft evolved into the love story Gracie. Fans will never forget how it encapsulated the essence of their collaboration. Something new softly crept into American living rooms on October 12, 1950. When the first episode of the George Burns and Gracie Allen show aired on CBS, nobody could have predicted how revolutionary this tiny sitcom would be for television. At a period when most shows were still constructed from taped segments or radio leftovers, it was hazardous to go live with a studio audience. However, when George emerged from a scene and addressed the audience directly, they were drawn in as though he were sitting next to them. The show quickly gained popularity. At its height, It brought them close to $200,000 every season and ran for 291 episodes until 1958. They portrayed themselves in a modest household environment, giving the impression that the outside world was peeking into their actual lives. That decision paved the way for the family sitcom boom that dominated the 1950s and influenced all that followed. In November 1951, episode 47 followed. The premise was straightforward and charming. Gracie's old campaign activities from the 1930s were connected to George's surprise birthday celebration. However, an early exploding prop cake was the true surprise. Everywhere, there was a blast of frost. After a moment of inaction, the cast started laughing heartily. All of it was broadcast live by the producers. The shock in the studio was heard by others at home, who thoroughly enjoyed it. Because there was no safety net in place for early television, mishaps like this one became part of its allure. That chaotic moment became one of the decade's most talked about scenes. However, a personal pain was concealed by the laughing on film. George acknowledged having a one-night affair while on tour in the early 1950s. He was devastated by the guilt. He bought Gracie a $750 silver centerpiece and a $10,000 diamond ring as a gesture of reconciliation. She said nothing. She never went up to him. The world thought they were flawless for decades. Only years later, in his memoirs, did the truth come to light. And Gracie's humor was present in that pain as well. She once said to Jack Benny's wife, Mary Livingstone, that she could use another centerpiece in hoping George would cheat again. A hidden world of remorse, forgiveness, and complex love lay behind all the glamour of their TV marriage. Gracie began to deteriorate as the decade went on. It was not until the 1950s that the severity of her untreated cardiac issues became apparent, even though she had had them from childhood. She became too ill to continue filming by 1957. George informed the audience she was on vacation, but he kept the truth to himself. She performed even after breaking her nose and persevered through angina attacks, but she was unable to continue indefinitely. She resigned in 1958 and passed away from a heart attack at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles on August 27, 1964. A television chapter that had influenced an entire era came to an end with her departure. Jack Benny appeared as a guest in 1956 while their show was still airing. Seeing the two giants together thrilled the fans. However, behind the scenes, George broke his hip at age 60 after tripping over a cable. He continued to work and spent the remainder of the season filming while seated. He later joked that it was a minor cost of comedy, turning that injury into another aspect of his reputation. Even as his bones gave way, his spirit remained unwavering. He was devastated on the day Gracie passed away. She passed away on August 27, 1964, at the age of 69, and George nearly passed out during her funeral. Later on, he said that he had only ever shed tears twice in his life, once for Gracie and once for his mother. He continued to perform live with an empty chair on stage for the next 2 years. He would turn to face it, give her lines, and announce to the crowd that she had just left the stage. He was joined in tears by others. Long after she was gone, the empty chair came to represent the affection he had for her. However, life continued on. He gave Wendy and Me, a new show, a go in 1965. He portrayed a landlord who monitored his tenants. It landed poorly. The show lacked the flair that Gracie brought. ABC ended it after just one season. George questioned whether his career had finished at age 69. After a lifetime of working as a partnership, he rebuilt from scratch, returned to nightclub tours, and discovered what it was like to work alone. He reached a breaking point in 1967. He was constantly smoking and drinking. He passed out on stage during a stint in Las Vegas. Doctors warned him that if he didn't quit, he wouldn't make it through the year. Overnight, he gave up on everything. No smokes, no drink, and no convenient crutch. He subsequently said that the decision saved his life and that it was a pivotal moment that sustained him for many years. He made another attempt in 1969 with a grandfather for Christmas specials. Fans kept saying the same thing, despite his hopes that they would remind people of who he was. The old banter was what they desired. The cigar was what they desired. Gracie's rhythm was what they desired. George started performing with guests like Carol Channing after realizing he needed another foil. The audience gradually warmed up once more. He found himself slowly. His autobiography, I Love Her, That's Why, was released in 1968. Over 100,000 copies were sold. With things like Gracie forgetting where she parked her car, it combined humor and candor. His first solo tour was financed by the success. It served as a springboard for a new career and marked his first appearance as an independent voice. Then he experienced one of the most shocking shocks of his life. He co-starred with Walter Matthau as Al Lewis in The Sunshine Boys in 1975. When the movie was released in December 1975, it immediately received positive reviews. He was 80 years old when he won Best Supporting Actor at the 48th Academy Awards on March 29, 1976. Richard Dreyfuss from Jaws was among the younger celebrities he defeated. Hollywood let out a gasp. Overnight, his victory made him a living legend. He co-starred with John Denver in Oh God the next year. The movie became one of 1977's biggest hits, earning over $51 million. George's trademark soft bite was evident in the way he delivered his lines. He even included a provision allowing him to smoke cigars on set in his contract. He started smoking when he was 14 years old, and he frequently smoked 10 to 15 cigars every day. The movie influenced his image in his later years, and audiences enjoyed seeing a witty god smoking a cigar. At the age of 87, he agreed to a 5-year contract with Caesars World in Las Vegas in November 1983. On his 100th birthday, he pledged to do a special performance. Although he played sold-out gigs far into his 90s, executives made jokes about wagering against him living that long. He even made a joke about how Julius owned Caesar's Palace the last time he played there. He was characterized by that contract as someone who consistently maintained both himself and the joke. At the age of 88, he underwent triple bypass surgery in 1984. For a year, most individuals would vanish. In a matter of months, he was back filming Oh God, You Devil, frequently using a wheelchair. He concealed it from the camera and gave each phrase the same vigor he had when he was younger. Everyone in his vicinity was motivated by his tenacity. He was honored by the Kennedy Center in 1988 at the age of 92. With B, he sang a duet. That evening, Midler. He combined his voice with her archival recordings for the Grammy-winning album Gracie, which was published later that year. When they were heard together again, fans sobbed. Time continued to take its toll, yet it seemed as though he had reached back in time to take her hand again. At the age of 98, he slipped in his bathtub in Beverly Hills in July 1994. He severely cut his head after hitting a soap dish. Doctors at Cedars-Sinai saw that he was slurring his words. In order to remove fluid from his brain, they had to do emergency surgery. His eagerly anticipated Caesars Palace performance, which had sold out almost a year earlier, had to be cancelled. After that collapse, his health never fully recovered, and after more than 80 years, his performance career came to an end. Even from his hospital bed, he continued to make people laugh. To feel alive, he continued dictating fresh lines and cracking jokes to friends like Milton Berle. Since he was too weak to celebrate his formal 100th birthday, he hosted a tiny private party at home in December 1995. He promised to see the guests at 101 and handed everyone cigars. He turned 100 on January 20, 1996. However, he passed away from cardiac arrest at home on March 9, 1996. However, fewer than 2 months after turning 100, George Burns passed away this morning in his bed at his Beverly Hills residence. The elderly comedian had recently been feeling better after being ill for some months. On October 10, 1996, his estate, valued at almost $30 million, was put up for auction at Sue's in Beverly Hills. Scripts and cigars were among the $266 lots. He bequeathed everything to the Motion Picture Fund, United Jewish Fund, and Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Ronnie and Sandra got nothing. Those who knew him realized that generosity had become his last means of giving back, even though some were taken aback. His impact never diminished. George's book, Living It Up, has frequently been cited by Jerry Seinfeld as having influenced his joke writing. George's straight guy manner, quiet delivery, and impeccable timing created the foundation of contemporary comedy. Doctors later claimed that his broad social circle and bright mind were what kept him alive, despite the fact that his cigars and martinis became symbols.